Okay, so let's get this underway. We have 100 people already in, and I'm sure that we're going to see more people filing in as we go along. Hi all, my name is Zoe Tishaev. I am a recent graduate of Parksburg High School, and by recent, I mean like 5 days ago. We had our virtual graduation on Monday. I'm part of many advocacy organizations, but today I'm here as a private citizen, as an urbanist enthusiast, and as someone who has been involved in the boundary change discussion of TPS. Today we'll be discussing a major issue that should be on all of our minds right now with the major racial and socioeconomic tensions going on around the nation. How did we in Montgomery County get here, and more importantly, how can we address it? As I mentioned earlier, because of our over 300 RSVPs, we have made the decision to make this a webinar instead of a traditional Zoom conversation. I do regret that decision. I would prefer it if we could all have a verbal face-to-face conversation, but in place of that, I have enabled chat so that everybody can talk with each other while we're discussing it, and you can respond to questions in the Q&A box. When you have questions to ask, please use the Q&A box so we have them in a nice organized format, but please do engage with discussion with other attendees in the chat box because this is supposed to be a discussion. So yeah, and so I'll give everyone a chance to introduce ourselves, but tonight we have with us local blogger Dan Reed, smart growth activist Jane Lyons, and planning board commissioner Partap Verma. And so I'll let everybody will be giving a presentation with short Q&As interspersed, and then we'll have one large Q&A for all three panelists at the end. I'll give everyone a chance to introduce themselves in that order. And so if our panelists can introduce themselves, say your name, what you do, what your presentation is going to be about, and as a fun icebreaker question, let's do tell us your favorite architectural style. And we'll start with Dan.
Hi, my name is, can you hear me all right? My name is Dan Reed. I am an urban planner and a writer who's lived in Silver Spring since 1991. I grew up here. I'm excited to be here and talk with you all today. And you know, when I was in architecture school growing up in college, we were one of the first things we learned is that style doesn't really exist. So as a result, I can't really answer that question.
All right, my name is Jane Lyons. I am the Maryland Advocacy Manager for the Coalition for Smarter Growth. Coalition for Smarter Growth is a regional advocacy nonprofit focused in the DC region specifically. And so most of my work is in Montgomery County, although I also work on Purple Line issues and some issues on the state level. And our advocacy is related to housing, land use, and transit issues. I did not grow up in Montgomery County, but I do live here now in downtown Silver Spring. And let's see, today I will be talking about Thrive Montgomery 2050, which is the newest update to the county's general plan. That update's still underway. And if none of those words make sense to you, that's okay, because I'm going to explain them all. And for the fun icebreaker, what was the icebreaker question? Oh, favorite architectural style. I did not go to planning school, nor am I like a big architecture person, but I really enjoyed a few summers ago walking around Savannah and Charleston. So I liked that style a lot, especially the streetscapes of Savannah were especially wonderful.
Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. My name is Partap Verma. I'm one of the commissioners, members on the Montgomery County Planning Board, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit about missing middle housing. In fact, I'm going to give a little presentation on it. Within the context of us expanding the boundary study for the Silver Spring Plan, which was the impetus for this conversation that we're having today. I'm also local. I'm a product of MCPS, grew up here, currently living in the neighborhood of Forest Glen. I was a civic activist here before I became a member on the planning board. And in terms of my favorite architectural style, I really like fusion. So in different kinds of fusion. I really enjoy mixing classic with modern. So I really like modern Tudor.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Is my audio at all better now, or is it still cutting off?
It seems okay to me.
Seems okay. All right, better? All right, great, awesome.
Maybe just talk slowly so
I
that when
thought
it's
that's
choppy.
what I'll do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, thank you everybody for your introductions. We're gonna hop right into it with starting off with Dan, who, yeah, go ahead, Dan.
All right. Let me just get my my slides ready here. Hold on a sec. Well, while I'm doing that, I'll introduce myself. Again, my name is Dan Reed. I'm an urban planner and a writer who lives in Silver Spring. I grew up here. Let's see, I have been for almost 14 years writing a neighborhood blog called Just Up the Pike. And I am super excited to talk to you today about some of the origins of Montgomery County and how we got here. First off, can everybody see my screen? Awesome. So I've given this presentation a couple of times, and I usually start it with the same question, which is, unfortunately, I can't ask for a show of hands, but maybe we can figure that out using Zoom. Who here has seen or heard of the TV show The Wonder Years?
Dan, we can do a show of hands. Attendees can, if you're using the Zoom application, you can go to more next to your name and raise your hand. So far, we have 26 people raising their hand.
Sweet. All right, 40, 47, 50, that's awesome. All right, so for those who haven't seen it, The Wonder Years was a sitcom that was on ABC from 1987 to 1993. It told the story of like an archetypal suburban American family called the Arnold family. It was set in the 1960s. And what's really interesting about that show is it is loosely based on its two creators' hometowns. Neil Martins grew up in Huntington, Long Island, New York. Carol Black grew up here in Montgomery County in Silver Spring. She went to Key Middle School and Springbrook High School. So I like to think of this show in some ways as a document of what it was like to live in Montgomery County during the mid-20th century. And to be honest, it was a fantastic time. There was a tremendous amount of growth and expansion out from Washington, D.C. as people were moving out of the city or flooding into the region from other parts of the country. There were a number of homebuilders who were active in the county building new neighborhoods, and you would see ads just like this one that made explicit a very simple promise. Growth is coming to Montgomery County because of its location. Because of that growth, there will be investments in the form of modern rapid transportation. Transportation will add value to your property. So if you buy a home now, you will have the chance to build wealth in this community. Here are pictures of homes in Silver Spring and comparisons of how much they would cost in DC or in Chevy Chase. And the promise being, you can buy a home here and become wealthy. We're going to take a brief second to look at the name on this ad here, Ebrook Lee. He was a prominent developer in Silver Spring, and we're going to come back to why that name is important in a second. This was a fantastical time. First, we expanded the county around streetcars and railroads, and later we built highways to provide access to virginal farmland at the region's edge, to open it up and create opportunities for people to build homes and neighborhoods and to move to the county and buy property. As people moved here, we provided amenities for them, both in the forms of public investments like schools and stuff, but also private investments like some of the country's first shopping malls like Wheaton Plaza. But there were a couple of big issues with this period of suburban expansion. One, it was kind of an environmental disaster. We did not have the regime of environmental laws that we have today. So it was very easy to clear cut a forest and just build a subdivision wherever, or to channelize a creek with concrete to control where the water flows. One of my fondest memories growing up is playing in the concrete channel in my parents' neighborhood where the creek used to be. It was also a very cannibalistic form of growth. Each new wave of investment basically drew money and people, particularly white people, from those older communities, creating constant cycles of disinvestment in older neighborhoods. Originally, this happened in the core of DC itself, but then it also began to happen in parts of Montgomery County too. Who can tell me what this is a picture of? This is a place you may remember in Montgomery County, but it looked very different 30 years ago.
Rockville, Maryland?
Close. Rockville looks like this too, to be honest. This is the fountain, where the fountain is in downtown Silver Spring, but This was a high-end suburb in the 1920s. It experienced tremendous white flight, middle class flight, and as a result of further outward development in the county. The other issue is that the county was heavily segregated by race and class. If you wanted to shop in one of these new shopping malls, you could not if you were a person of color, particularly if you were Black. If you wanted to purchase a home in Montgomery County, there would be something attached to the contract for your home called a covenant that would say you could not sell your home to a Black person, to a Middle Eastern person, to a Jewish person, and in the bougier sections of Montgomery County, to an Eastern European or Catholic person even. And the result was that you could purchase a home in this county as an opportunity to build wealth, but only if you were a certain kind of person. And there were a couple of tools that enabled that. One was covenants, another was redlining. In the Great Depression, the federal government wanted to stop people from losing their homes and their life savings. So they created the Federal Housing Administration and these maps of every city in the country that basically helped the federal government determine where they could back loans, in turn ensuring the government's investments, right? This map is called a redlining map because it is typically red. This is black and white, but the areas that were colored green on the map were almost exclusively affluent and white communities that were generally staying that way. In this region in the 1930s, that meant Northwest DC, it meant Bethesda and Chevy Chase in Montgomery County, it meant a small portion of Silver Spring, namely Woodside Park and an area called Seven Oaks. The areas that were colored red on the map were areas where the government would not give you a mortgage to buy a home or back a mortgage. Those areas were generally other eastern parts of Montgomery County, like Wheaton and Tacoma Park, parts of Tacoma Park. It was most of Prince George's County, and it was nearly all of DC east of Rock Creek Park. And that created a pattern of segregation that persists to this day, and we'll come back to that too. The third tool was zoning. Originally in the early 1900s, many American cities instituted what was called race-based zoning, in which the government would literally say, this neighborhood is for white people and this neighborhood is for Black people. A 1916 Supreme Court decision, Buchanan v. Worley, said, no, you can't do that because you're preventing white people from making money off their homes. If they want to sell their homes to Black people, they should. 10 years later, the Supreme Court went back on that with a different decision called Euclid v. Ambler, which basically said that governments were allowed to create use-based zoning in their communities to protect people's investments and property values. This has some good parts. For instance, it keeps people from building a factory next to your house, which can be toxic and polluting and has major health issues. On the other hand, Euclid v. Ambler, the Supreme Court basically described apartment buildings as parasites on neighborhoods and said that it was okay to ban affordable homes from communities to protect those who had access to the wealth to buy a large detached home. This is a map of zoning in Montgomery County. In the vast majority of it, the yellow and the green areas, you are only allowed to build a detached house on a large lot. We'll come back to what that means in a little bit too. But the result is, when you have a tremendous amount of public investment going into creating access to land, but you also have a bunch of policies that restrict who can access that land and purchase homes there, the result are communities that are increasingly bifurcated by class and race. And the same things that are used to create accessibility to land are also dividing neighborhoods up like highways. And as our county continued to build out during the 20th century, we started to basically form enclaves where people of color and working people had no other choice to live, and a cycle in which people of color and working people could not climb their way up the economic ladder. And if you did not fit into the white nuclear family middle class ideal that this county was built around, particularly if you didn't have access to a car or were too young or old to drive a car, you were kind of stuck. Rinse and repeat for 50 years, more development, more outward growth, more sprawl, more traffic as people are forced to travel longer and longer distances to access jobs or services or daily needs, particularly people who are less affluent. And you get the situation we're in today. So what do we do about it? You know, there was a big discussion a year or two ago about the Green New Deal, which is a package of bills that was basically proposed to promote economic and social justice in the United States. And my friend Alex Baca wrote about the Green New Deal in Slate magazine and pointed out there was one key thing missing: land use. Our physical geography, where we sleep, work, shop, and send our kids to play, and how we move between those places. More foundational to a green, fair future than just about anything else. Montgomery County has made a huge effort to try and tackle climate change in the past couple of years, echoing some of the ideals of the Green New Deal. And land use is a big part of that. So I talk about where we went, and that was the Wonder Years. Who here has seen the TV show Hey Arnold? Show of hands. Good, good. Solid younger crowd. For those who haven't seen it, Hey Arnold was a cartoon in the 1990s on Nickelodeon. It was based on the creator Steven Hillenburg's hometown of Seattle, and it is basically a show about a group of fourth graders who have the key to the city. They go on all sorts of adventures. They don't obviously have cars because they're 9. They walk and they bike and they take the bus places and have very full, free lives without parents. And you can start to see little glimpses of what that life could look like here in Montgomery County. This is a picture of the Kentlands, a neighborhood that was built in the 1980s based on the historical patterns of communities in the early 20th century. Not the racist part, the part where people didn't have cars. Things were closer together, shops were closer to homes, you could walk to the school or the movie theater or even to work if you wanted to, or to transit. There was a broad mix of housing types in these communities so that many different kinds of people could afford to live in them. And communities like Kentlands basically proved that there was a demand for more places like this in Montgomery County, diverse, integrated, walkable communities. And so that led to investment in older places like downtown Silver Spring, which was built as a walkable urban place 100 years ago and is starting to reclaim that, particularly as it has become a much more diverse place with people who actually benefit from having lots of different types of homes and different types of ways to get around and public spaces that everybody can benefit from. And the county is making meaningful investments to make this a reality. Building the Purple Line, for instance, which will connect some of the poorest and some of the wealthiest communities in the United States and provide better access to jobs and amenities. Investing in active transportation, that's stuff like sidewalks and bike lanes, to give people who can't drive or don't have access to cars equal footing on our roads. It also means investing in housing in these communities so that people can actually live near these amenities and benefit from them. And the cool thing about this more urban, compact, type of building is that it does end up being more integrated. You have lots of different types of homes, big homes, little homes, expensive homes, cheap homes, single family homes, apartments, townhomes. And it's a lot easier for people to mix together and to have access to things. Now, these communities aren't always exclusively affordable, and we'll come back to that in a second too. But it's a sign of how we could do things differently in this county. I think one of the coolest aspects of that is not only have we seen some of our older downtowns and town centers receive more investment, but they've become hubs for the diversity that makes this county great. Montgomery County became a majority-minority county in 2010. And one of the ways you see that manifest is in our downtowns, but also in the businesses that immigrant communities are creating here, particularly food, not limited to food, but definitely food. For example, this restaurant in Silver Spring, which explicitly hyped itself as the Ethiopian Chipotle. So I talked about where we've been as a county. I talked about where I think we're going as a county. So now I have to ask, who here has seen or participated in a public hearing at the county council or the school board or the planning board? Show of hands. Usually this is of the 3 the worst participation, but today I'm wrong. We have in this county a legacy of limiting access to resources and by extension wealth to certain people in this community. And people aren't going to tell you that they are supporting that regime, but they work very hard to protect what they view as the status quo that has benefited from them in the past. And the result is, to this day, after legal segregation has ended, after the Civil Rights Act has passed, and the Fair Housing Act, and Brown versus Board, all of the things that make this county amazing and special and worth living in, it's socioeconomic and racial diversity, cool, interesting local music and art, awesome minority and immigrant-owned businesses, dense social networks and friends and neighbors and loved ones close by, confusing and weird things. All of these things sort of exist outside of a built environment that was largely intended for white middle to upper middle class families 50 and 60 years ago. And you can see that in the way our communities are zoned. In the vast majority of Montgomery County, if you want to build a detached single-family home standing by itself on a lot, the most expensive kind of home you can build, you can do it pretty much anywhere. If you want to do anything else, to create a neighborhood where you can walk to things, to create townhomes or apartments or affordable housing of any way, shape, or form, it's really difficult and complicated. And in part, we designed the system that way to privilege people who already have theirs. And the result is we have basically ensured that people who benefit from a racist and classist status quo get to entrench it every time we have a public process designed around making decisions about how we should look for the future. Now, as I said, people aren't always explicit about these intentions. Most of them would not identify themselves as racists, and they aren't. Some of them are. Some of them use explicitly bigoted language, talking about changing demographics, talking about political agendas, comparing Montgomery County to Prince George's County, a dog whistle about the most affluent majority Black county in the country, using terminology like neighborhood schools or neighborhood character. Sometimes people use more general references to the status quo that are tied in with identity, suburban, not urban, limit our density, like things like that, using urban as a connotation for what they don't want their community to look like. Sometimes people even use the language of social environmental justice. For example, these two women staged a protest outside the Tacoma Park Silver Spring Co-op 2 years ago. They held up signs that said, "We can't breathe," which were the final and dying words of Eric Garner and George Floyd and so many Black men who were murdered by cops. What were they protesting? They were protesting the construction of a shopping center and before that affordable housing on a parking lot. And we see so many conversations like that that disguise themselves in some sort of social or environmental justice, but in reality, just entrench the status quo. Look at, for instance, the town of Chevy Chase and the Columbia Country Club spending tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars to do environmental studies to block the Purple Line, which would take cars off the road and reduce emissions from cars. Or look at companies like this one that promise homeowners to win environmental battles by fighting things like apartments in their neighborhood that protect land from being developed and used up in other places. We consider ourselves a progressive, tolerant, liberal community, especially after the 2016 election. We wanted to set this example for what Montgomery County could be. People put signs like this in their yards saying, no matter where you're from, we're glad you're a neighbor. People put Black Lives Matter signs in their yard. People marched in Black Lives Matter marches in this county over the past 2 weeks. And yet, this is actually a sign from DC, but I'm using it as an example because you'll find a sign like this one in people's yards here in Montgomery County that says, don't build something, or stop this thing, or save this thing. In this case, McMillan Park was not a park, and it wasn't being saved. But what the neighbors who put those signs in their yards were successfully able to do was block 700 homes, including subsidized forever affordable housing, a grocery store, medical offices, and 8 actual acres of parkland that the community will not get to enjoy. And the result, for anyone who does not fit into this binary that Montgomery County has created, and many suburbs like it has created, if you are not white, if you are not middle class, if you are a single woman or a single parent, if you are a queer person, if you are an immigrant, you get to play the game of musical chairs, where you get everything that's left over from people who have had access to privilege and generational wealth. Here's that map again of redlining from the 1930s. These darker colored areas, the ones that say A and B and C, were the areas where the federal government would back and insure mortgages, thus ensuring people had access to build wealth and equity over time. You can see bits of Bethesda, Chevy Chase, a little teeny bit of Silver Spring. This is a map, same scale, from a couple of years ago, looking at commute times in Montgomery County. The lighter colors are areas that have the shortest commutes, the quickest access to jobs. The darkest colors are the ones that have longer commutes and longer access to jobs. And you can see it's those areas further north and further east that were redlined and adjacent to redlined areas 80 years ago that have longer commutes. Here's a map of how home values have rebounded since the Great Recession. The lighter colored areas are those that have preserved or increased their home values, increased equity over time in the past 15 years. The darker colored areas are areas that have lost home value and where people have perhaps lost value in their homes. Again, those are the areas that were redlined or adjacent to being redlined. Here is a map of elementary schools in Montgomery County and the percentage of white and Asian students in those schools. Once again, the communities that were promised access to mortgages 80 years ago and the areas adjacent to them have the highest percentage of white and Asian students today, while the areas that were redlined and adjacent to redlined areas have the highest percentage of Black, Hispanic, and multiracial students. And because we have so closely tied your skin color and your background to your ability to gain wealth in this country, those are also the areas that have the highest percentage of students on free and reduced lunch. And you can see that in our school system. You can see that in our neighborhoods. And you can see the cycle happening over and over again that just perpetuates who has access to wealth and who doesn't. And it's a lot finer grained than you might expect. For instance, here are two homes in Montgomery County. You can see they are identical. Winchester Homes built both of them in 1985. They were 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom homes. They're both on quarter-acre lots. Both similar color, similar styles, everything. In 1985, both of these homes were worth $200,000. That's about $480,000 today. The house on the right was located in a school catchment that didn't have a great reputation. It was a fairly diverse school. It had a high minority population, and parents were reluctant to send their kids there. And in 1987, when Montgomery County tried to redraw school boundaries, people in adjacent school catchments lost it because they didn't want their kids going to that school. The home on the left was in the catchment for another school in the county that at one time was the #2 high school in Montgomery County and the state. It had strong academic programs while having a fairly diverse population as well. But those two schools and those two neighborhoods have had very different paths since then. One was in a community that was adjacent to communities that had had historic access to wealth, and as a result accumulated jobs and shopping and all sorts of amenities that built value into that community and in turn attracted people who wanted to live there. The other home was in an area that increasingly became less affluent over time due to white flight. And today, those two homes are in vastly different price ranges. The home on the right was zoned for Richard Montgomery High School, and today is worth 50% more than the other house, which was zoned for Springbrook High School, that house is basically worth the same as it was 30 years ago, simply because of where it was and who got to live in that community. The question is, and this is what Jane and Partap will talk about in the rest of this presentation, is this county is continuing to grow, and we have to figure out where we're going to put people in this county. We have created a system in which the vast majority of Montgomery County, these yellow and green areas, where people have had the most access to develop and build wealth, are basically off limits to new growth and new people. And everything else is where we get to put those new homes. And these places aren't necessarily empty. These are places where people already live or do work, or commercial zones or industrial zones, or in many cases, garden apartments, the most affordable homes in the county and the places where people have had the least ability to basically determine what happens to the world around them. So we have this little trickle of growth that happens in a few places in the county, and the result that home values are astronomical because we've created things that people want to be near and have access to, but we make it really hard for people to get to them. And the flip side of that is, as white flight and middle class flight continues to happen, we're now seeing a new wave of disinvestment in slightly newer suburban communities. This is a home pretty close to my parents' house in East County. It's built in the 1980s. And after the Great Recession, the family who owned this home lost their mortgage, and basically the house was abandoned for several years. And not only that, but you see this in the shopping centers, in communities that were built for white middle-class people with cars, but now have a much more diverse community with much more diverse needs that aren't being served by their built environment. And so the question that I leave you with is, what do we do next? So that's my piece.
I can't hear you, Zoe. Now you're on mute. Nope. We'll just have to try to read lips. Oh, other people in the chat can hear you. Apparently, I just can't hear you.
That's a great question. Part of the reason is, so these maps are using MCPS data, and they do break out demographics by white, Asian, Black, and Hispanic, which are limited categories. But one of the reasons why these two groups are often lumped together is if you look at different outcomes, social and economic and health outcomes, whites and Asians tend to perform fairly closely to one another, and Black and Latinx people tend to also perform considerably worse. You can see this in homeownership rates in the county and income levels and all sorts of different outcomes. It doesn't mean that Asian people are not minorities or don't have minority stress or minority challenges. And I say that as somebody who is half Black and half East Indian, but it does introduce some nuance into the conversations we have about race and ethnicity in the county. I did leave a cliffhanger there. Ebrook Lee was one of the biggest developers in Montgomery County, but he was also an ardent segregationist. Ebrook Lee in Silver Spring and Francis Newlands, who was the big developer in Chevy Chase, were both heavily opposed to building integrated neighborhoods and fought efforts to create integrated communities in Montgomery County. And that's part of why there's a conversation right now about renaming Ebrook Lee Middle School because of that legacy that he had. Oh, text.
Okay, I can hear Dan. I just can't hear you, Zoe, like at all. Should I try logging out and logging back in since you might? No? Okay, I will not do that. I will just give the presentation. So great, I will share my screen now. All right, so to introduce myself again, my name is Jane Lyons. I'm the Maryland Advocacy Manager for the Coalition for Smarter Growth. We're a regional advocacy nonprofit focused on the DC region, and our mission is to create more walkable, inclusive, transit-oriented communities. And I have the very difficult job of going after Dan Reed, one of the best speakers in all of Montgomery County and possibly the DC region. But I'm going to talk about where do we go from here. So that's the history. That's where we are now, and that's how we got here. What do we do about it? So I'm going to talk about Thrive Montgomery 2050, which is the update to the county's general plan. What is a general plan? So a general plan looks at the entire county, unlike a master plan or a functional plan, which only looks at one specific thing or one specific area of the county. So we're looking at the entirety of Montgomery County to determine how and where we will grow over the next 30 years. That slide that Dan showed, that we have these tens of thousands of people who are projected to move to Montgomery County, which is great. We want them to move here to be in inclusive, walkable, sustainable communities and not to sprawl out in the greater region. But how are we going to house them? How are we going to make sure that everybody has an affordable, safe, great place to live? And the general plan requires implementation. It alone does not change zoning or change policies. It sets pretty much the 10,000-foot picture and lays the groundwork for where do we go from here. And thus it will guide the planning department's work program, what they work on for the next, for the foreseeable future, as well as hopefully the county council's policy agenda. This isn't under statute, but the issues that are made really prominent and the goals that are identified, a lot of those will have to come through the county council. And these are issues that relate to housing, to transportation, to land use, environmental protection. It doesn't focus on as much some things like schools, but really these issues of land use. So here's a brief history of Montgomery's general plan. They started preparing for the first general plan in 1958, and 1964 was really the first And the last time that we had a really comprehensive update to the general plan, it was called on wedges and corridors, and it was done in conjoinment with partnership with Prince George's County's planning department. And it was called on wedges and corridors because of this idea that all of the growth in the DC region should be focused around these major transportation corridors going out from Washington, D.C. So the major corridor in Montgomery County was I-270. That plan was later updated in 1969 and then approved by that council, and then was only again updated in a very limited refinement related to housing in 1993. So what are the outcomes of those plans? This is an image from the 1993 plan, but generally follows the same idea as the original wedges and corridors concept. So we have the agricultural reserve. Hopefully you can see my, my cursor here. The agricultural reserve is this gold color. That's the top portion of the county in Poolsville and Damascus. And that is protected land. And then we have the I-270 corridor with those corridor cities that were envisioned in the original general plan: Rockville, Gaithersburg, Germantown, and Clarksburg. We've got the urban ring that's closer to DC and inside of the Beltway, and then the suburban communities and the residential wedge. So we've mostly kept up with this way of growing. We have that map on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side is Montgomery County's population density. You can see that this is basically more or less how the county has developed. Most of the growth has been concentrated around the Beltway and around DC, and then everything else is mostly along the I-270 corridor, kind of with the exception of Olney over there. And the plan not only had these major, this idea of how we grow and the type of growth we should have, but some goals. They identified back in the 1960s that there was a lack of affordable housing in Montgomery County. A lot of teachers and firefighters were having to move out to Howard or Frederick County, not too different than where we are today. And the outcome of that was the moderately priced dwelling unit program, which I'll talk about in a second. One of the other goals was to preserve farmland for future generations. An outcome of that was the agricultural reserve. Another one of the main goals was timing public facilities like schools and transportation with growth. And the outcome of that was the subdivision staging policy. Because I know that there are a lot of people who might not know as much about these policies, a brief description of the moderately priced dwelling unit program, or MPDU program, is that any time that a developer builds like an apartment building or a new subdivision that has 20 or more housing units, a certain percentage of those housing units have to be made affordable to households that have a moderate income. This graphic here is not a description of Montgomery County's program, because this program has been since duplicated in hundreds of jurisdictions across the country. Montgomery County was really one of the first to pioneer it, which was great. And the fact that the developer has to include these below market rate units is offset by a density bonus. And that's the yellow part, or the orange part there. So a building gets to get a little bit taller to offset the fact that a developer has to provide these below market rate units that are income restricted. So in Montgomery County, the program has been really successful. It's provided, let's see, a total of 16,000 units over its lifetime, although some of those are not currently still in the program. They were phased out due to time limits. But in general, it's thought to be a very successful program, but obviously on its own has not solved affordable housing, the affordability crisis in Montgomery County. And then the other major outcome is the agricultural reserve that I alluded to earlier. It's 1/3 of the county's land, roughly, that cannot be developed in a significant way. It is reserved for agricultural uses, as the name suggests. So why is the general plan important? Because of everything that Dan talked about, because how we've grown has exacerbated segregation as well as climate change. And the original general plan, it didn't go far enough, not only with housing affordability, but also with its ideas on transportation. Although in some cases it had some pretty bold ideas on transportation that we just haven't implemented. And so updating it is our chance to set the county on a new course to build neighborhoods that are mixed income, that are integrated, sustainable, and prosperous. So a little bit about that update. They're calling it Thrive Montgomery 2050, and the process to update this plan has been underway since last summer, August 2019. This is a timeline of the plan, although I think there have been a few updates to it since I last made this slide. So the plan's development started last summer and will go through basically summer 2021. So we've got about a year to really make an impact and make sure that this plan creates the vision and sets the goals that we want to have. Right now, highlighted in red, we're in the part where we are reviewing the policies and actions that have been drafted by the planning department staff. And then in the fall, they're going to bring the full draft plan to the planning board. The planning board will review that through a series of work sessions. And then once they vote on it, they will transmit it to the county council. And then the county council will do a similar thing of work sessions to talk about different parts in the plan, and then we'll approve the plan hopefully next summer. So that's where we're at now. A little bit about the content of the plan. The three lenses that staff are looking at all of the issues in the plan through are economic health, community equity, and environmental resilience. And I give them credit because I think that this plan does what a lot of master plans and planning documents don't do, which is pay mind to how all of these things are interconnected. It's not just housing and the environment. Housing policy is climate policy, and we need to realize how those two things are interconnected, as well as with all of the other things like transportation. So these are the 8 in the blue boxes here. These are the 8 issue areas that the planning staff have identified. You can read them for yourself. And those will become the chapters of the plan. So for example, within complete communities, there is a vision for what complete communities look like, a series of goals within complete communities, and then subsequent policies, and then actions for how to implement those policies. One of the big ideas that I wanted to pull out is this idea of complete communities and 15-minute living. It's an idea that's gained traction everywhere from Melbourne, Australia, to Seattle, to Paris, France. And the idea is that within a certain amount of time, like 15 or 20 minutes, you should be able to access all of the things you need for your daily life. And that includes healthy food, frequent transportation, green space, healthcare, quality schools, basically everything that you need in your 20-minute or 15-minute neighborhood. And the idea behind this is to be able to get to those things within that amount of time without getting into a car. By being able to get to these things by walking, or taking a bus, riding a bike, or rolling on roller skates, anything that is not sort of adding to the greenhouse gas emissions in our environment. And complete communities require density and diversity. And Dan talked a lot about this, that we need density to support local businesses, to support transit, to support the fact that if we want to be near things, then we're going to have to put things closer together, and then that thus makes them more dense. One of the reasons that we sprawled out post-World War II in the United States was because of the car. So we could get to things faster and they didn't have to be as close to each other. If we're going to move away from relying on personal vehicles so much, then things need to come back together to be a little bit closer again. And diversity is really important, especially diversity of housing types. And here, and Partap's going to talk a lot more about this. This is a brief intro of what missing middle housing is. On one side, you have single family detached homes, and on the other side, you have high rises. And those are the two housing types that we see a lot in Montgomery County, along with townhomes. But there's a whole range of other housing types that you just don't really see in Montgomery County or really anywhere in the United States, because they're not allowed. They're illegal through zoning, and that's why they're missing. So we need diversity of housing types, because with a diversity of housing types comes a diversity of people. And that's how we really can create these mixed income and racially integrated neighborhoods. And then the other big idea in Thrive 2050 is that these complete communities, all of these complete neighborhoods, are connected by safe multimodal boulevards. This is a selection from the recent Veers Mill Corridor Master Plan that shows how they imagine Veers Mill to look in the future. So there's a lot of street trees, there's a bike lane, there are bus lanes, and that is somewhere that I would feel comfortable walking, unlike the current time on Veers Mill Road, which is one of the highest used transit corridors in all of the state of Maryland, and also has some of the highest pedestrian injury and fatality rates in all of the county. So transforming these places, it's about safety, it's about sustainability, and it's about being able to support this type of mixed-use neighborhood. So how can you get involved? I want to continue this conversation with all of you who are listening tonight. This is not the end, this is only the beginning. So you can get involved. I've been organizing a group called Montgomery for All that is pushing for a progressive, sustainable, inclusive general plan that upholds smart growth principles. And my goal for this is to also make sure that this group is as diverse as possible, as diverse and representative of the county. And that's racially diverse, age diverse, geographically diverse. And so we need your voice at the planning table, because as Dan showed, the people who are at the table right now are mostly white, they're mostly homeowners, and they're mostly not the people who will necessarily be around in 2050 and trying to live their lives and start their own families and communities. So we need your voice. The Montgomery for All platform has 10 goals. I put a few of them here. This includes all the stuff that we've been talking about. And here's a QR code. I don't really know how to use QR codes, so this is a bit of a new thing for me, about how you can sign up for Montgomery for All. And or if you don't really know QR codes like me, you can use the sort of bit.ly URL that's below the QR code. And once you sign up for that, you'll get emails about monthly meetings, actions you can take in support of this type of general plan, and also events that we're doing. So that is the first thing that you can do to continue this conversation. The second thing that you can do is to register for an event that is similar to this, but I think if this is a 101, this is like a 102. It is a series of facilitated workshops called Courageous Conversations on Housing, Land Use, and Racism. And so you'll learn a lot about what you learned today about the history of redlining and segregation in Montgomery County. But in addition to that, we have a group called Challenging Racism who will be facilitating small group discussions throughout these 3-hour-long events. And we'll also have specific materials. For example, in the August 15th event, we are going to be talking about specifically East County, and then Bethesda, Chevy Chase, and then Up County, because all these places have very different histories, especially Up County is very interesting. So Dan has been in our planning committee for that. We've had a wonderful planning committee engaging with local community leaders. So I urge you to register for those events. And there's the URL or QR code. Thank you. All right, so I cannot hear you, Zoe. I will look in the chat. Okay, so the question, what is the difference between suburban communities and residential wedge in the plan? That's a great question, and I'm not sure of the technical answer to that question, but I think it's really just a question of density. I think it's just as you move out from sort of the urban ring and the corridor cities, everything just becomes more and more low density. So the residential wedges are lower density than the suburban communities envisioned in that plan. Question 2, should the general plan take into account parking meters, other disruptions, making sidewalks inaccessible to people with disabilities? I'd say that that's probably not a question for necessarily the general plan, but happening right now is a pedestrian master plan, which is what's known as a functional master plan, because it is focused on one issue but looks at the entire county. So recently, the county also did a bicycle master plan that looked at bikeways across the entire county. Now they're doing a similar thing, but with sidewalks. Although it's so much more than sidewalks. It's also the policies around what goes on a sidewalk, where do sidewalks go, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a lot of great work being done around that that'll recommend specific actions that the Department of Transportation and other agencies can take to make sidewalks more accessible and walking and rolling in general more accessible for everybody.
There is actually something that specifically talks about what the person was asking, which is Montgomery County is working on something called the Complete Streets Design Guide.
Also that.
This is part of my day job, is working on projects like this, and that actually gives specific design guidance for how to create sidewalks and to ensure they are both accessible and that people have room to move. That was just, the draft has been completed and is now out for public comment. So that specifically is talking about exactly what that person meant.
Yes, so thank you, Dan. 2 things going on that specifically address issues of accessibility: pedestrian master plan and complete streets design guide. Awesome stuff. And thank you for Sanjita for putting in the chat contact info about Eli Glazier, who's the project lead for the pedestrian master plan. And the link to the complete streets design guide. All right, I'm gonna leave and then rejoin so I can hear Zoe. Thank you guys so much for listening to me.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes, okay, great. Well, I'm going to share my screen. So my name is Partap Verma. I am one of the commissioners on the Montgomery Planning Board. I got appointed last year. Gosh, I can't believe it's been one whole entire year. I am from Silver Spring, went to MCPS, went to University of Maryland for undergrad, Penn State Law, and I got started locally advocating for smart growth, pedestrian safety, and affordable housing in my neighborhood. And so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about missing middle housing. It's one of our tools in our toolkit that we are hoping to use. And one of the reasons why we want to talk about this is particularly in the context of Silver Spring. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So what is missing middle? So generally speaking, the term missing middle refers to multi-unit clustered housing. And as Jane was showing in that graphic, that can include townhouses, courtyard dwellings, smaller apartment buildings. And that generally bridges the gap between low and high density areas. We don't see it as often today, as Jane had mentioned, but it was common during the pre-World War II era and largely has disappeared in recent decades, mostly because single-family homes and larger kind of multi-family residential developments have become really popular. So you often have, especially you'll see in Silver Spring or Bethesda, you'll see a single-family home and then you'll see a high-rise, but often there's not anything in between. So that's something that missing middle is trying to address. Missing middle has also been recognized as a potential solution to providing residential options. And that includes affordability, like we mentioned, increasing diverse populations for downsizing seniors, young families, newcomers to the region. But developing these projects can often be challenged, especially because of market and economic challenges, unfavorable neighborhood perceptions, as we've seen recently, and our own regulatory requirements, which quite frankly haven't caught up to this kind of housing. The link that you see here, this is a 2018 study that the planning board had done planning department. It provides an in-depth analysis of the challenges and also identifies ways that we can address missing middle through policy changes or incentives. So take a look at that. So why do we need missing middle housing? Well, we're in a housing crisis. We need to grow our housing supply to relieve pressure on the market, stabilize rents, and ensure that housing is attainable to a broad range of incomes. Declining production and increased development costs have resulted in rising housing costs and increase, of course, in the number of cost-burdened households. So our failure to deliver suitable and attainable housing has created a housing supply mismatch with negative secondary effects on our neighborhoods, schools, environment, transportation infrastructure, and economic health. One of the housing, so we talk about housing targets in 2019, as many of you may know, the county council passed a resolution that basically said to support housing targets over the next 10 years, we need to be building about 10,000 units on top of the already forecasted 31,000 units. Thrive 2050, as Jane mentioned, provides an opportunity to look for these new tools to increase our housing production to meet the needs of current and future residents. With regards to population growth, we're expected to add about 200,000 residents by 2050. If we don't grow our supply and make room for these new residents, our existing communities will become more expensive, less diverse, integrated, and quite frankly, it's going to be really hard to attract and retain skilled workforce. We talk about climate change crisis. This is one of the tools that will help, and it's good housing policy. And of course, exclusionary zoning, which has been a large part of the conversation recently. Single-family zoning shouldn't be a barrier to neighborhoods. It's an important step in how the county begins to address past inequities in housing choice, and also creates more options for housing that is affordable, attainable to current and future residents. As many of you know, the county also has passed a racial and equity bill, and the planning department also views policies and programs through that racial equity lens. So how are the current barriers what are the current barriers to building this missing middle housing? Well, many of the single family zones in Montgomery County do allow for some types of missing middle types of housing options, namely what you've probably have seen, some duplexes and the townhouse. So why is it hard to build this kind of housing in Montgomery County? Well, there are a couple of reasons why the standards of the existing single family zones make it hard to build missing middle. First of all, the process. To get to these kind of missing middle types of housing options, you have to go through what we call an optional method of development. Optional method development can allow more density and create flexibility that is allowed under the standard method and generally requires more discretionary review. This is important if you want to do if you were to do a tear down and rebuild a single family detached home and rebuild a family detached home, you could do this by right. So this means you can go to the Department of Permitting Services, DPS, for a permit for a tear down, rebuild without ever going to the planning department. Optional method projects generally require more process. So you would have to go through additional planning department review and planning board approval. So long story short, if you don't have it baked into the zoning, it's going to be more complicated and quite frankly, more costly. Now, affordable housing requirements, optional method projects also have an affordable housing requirement of MPDUs. So even if the project has less than 20 units. So even small infill projects would be required to be subjected to the 12.5% of units as affordable in order to build a duplex or townhouse project. So while the MPDU requirement on new development is an important part of achieving our affordable housing goals, the MPDU program is a complete developer subsidy. Given the economies of scale, the cost of MPDUs is hard to scale for smaller projects, which is often why the requirement is only on projects with 20 or more units. So projects generally between 11 and 19 units are required to pay into the Housing Initiative Fund, which is about 0.5% at the sales price at the settlement. Another thing is the usable area requirements. Optional method projects also have usable area requirements. So like an R60 zone, for instance, the usable area requirement is 3 acres. So finding or assembling 3 acres near some of our more desirable high capacity transit neighborhoods is actually not that easy. And with regards to density, at its most densest, the R60 zone allows around 9 units per acre, significantly less dense than what you would find in the missing middle typologies that Jane showed earlier. So what tools do we have? Well, in recent master plans, we've introduced creative solutions to try to see how do we address this missing middle housing option. Recently, in both Viersmo and Forest Glen master plan, we recommended changing the zoning from the R60 to CRN or CRNF zone, with the master plan actually having language guidance that supported the missing middle housing. So the CRN zone, which is a type of code, is the least dense zone in the commercial residential family of zones. What does that provide? Well, in terms of height, CRN it's a mixed use that can allow multifamily development in heights up to 65 feet, which is higher than what you would see in a typical missing middle product like townhouses. In the master plans, we typically will cap that height at about 40 or 50 feet. Now, just so you know, in some cases, depending on what neighborhood you're in and R60 versus R90 zone, you do have some single family homes that are between 30 and 35 feet. So you're not talking a whole lot more taller than some of the larger teardowns that we're seeing. There's some guiding language as well. The language like greater variation housing types, medium density housing, or multi-unit clustered housing, such as townhouses, courtyards, small apartment buildings. They're all designed to give that aim where we can actually define what that missing middle could be on certain particular parcels. So we're talking about potential granular kind of designations. And there are also floating zones. So due to tax implications for certain property owners, changing the zone from R60 to CRN, we use a floating zone designation to ensure that the higher tax rate would only be applied to the property owner who intends to take advantage of the new zone. And so that does require, though, however, a significant amount of process. So even while the CRN zone has a creative approach to filling the gap in the zoning code, the reality is if we want to build more types of this kind of housing frequently, we need to make sure that the zoning code is equipped with the tools to do so. So we're hoping that Montgomery Thrive Montgomery 2050 is going to set up some policy guidance to allow some sort of creation for these tools. So going to Thrive, our communities have diverse needs. We know this. Montgomery County has the most diverse cities in all of America: Silver Spring, Germantown, Gaithersburg, Rockville, to name a few. But we also know that the housing supply gap will continue into the future. Thrive 2050, we're hoping to ensure that the exclusively single-family zoning is not going to be a barrier to development in neighborhoods near employment centers and transit. The plan will include policies and actions that support the production of different types of housing near transit, including an existing single-family zones. And that's an important point that needs to be made over and over again, is that we're really looking for the future for housing types beyond the single-family home setup. This, we believe, is an important step in how the county begins to address past inequities, as Dan mentioned in his presentation, in housing choice, while also creating more options of housing that's affordable and attainable to current and future residents of all income levels. 2050, Thrive Montgomery 2050 recommends modest increases of density in areas currently zoned exclusively for single-family housing and near high-capacity transit that would provide more housing types such as duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and other kind of affordable housing options. And just so you know, I grew up in a duplex, and I really appreciate that opportunity that I had, or my parents did rather, to live in that kind of housing that allowed them to have different options, particularly being able to save money so they can move to the next or graduate to the next level of housing. So Silver Spring, so this obviously is one of the reasons why we're here. You know, there was so much interest in Silver Spring, and it's amazing that we have so many people on a Friday night logged in, listening to planning issues facing our county. So I just want to put that out there. That is incredible. So as I said earlier, Silver Spring is one of the most diverse areas. By expanding the boundary of the plan area, and I just want to be very clear on this, we are in the exploration process of exploring how missing middle can be permitted in a location that may be suitable for an urban area that is about to add basically 2 new transit connections with the Purple Line, bus rapid transit. And so right now there isn't a zoning code that does not have the flexibility to add the duplexes and triplexes or townhouses in the downtown area. This is our opportunity to use both the master plan process and county-wide endeavors to find ways to build missing middle housing. So, are you going to upzone everything in downtown Silver Spring? This is a question we're getting a lot these days. With choosing option D, if you were following it last week, which was at the time the most expensive option as with the boundary that the staff will implement, we're going to be implementing a 2-district approach for the plan. So with this blocks included in the plan, we anticipate approaching it as a plan for 2 distinct areas, the downtown area and the surrounding neighborhoods. So we're going to work with the community and property owners to find appropriate densities and height for each. So I'll say that one more time. We're going to be working with the community and property owners to find appropriate densities and heights for each. So this is going to be an engaging process. This is going to be planning that's going to be happening on a granular level once again, and it's going to be highly customized to parcels in this area. As per process for every master plan, each parcel will be evaluated for rezoning based on several factors, including conversation with the community, property owner, existing zoning capacity, and development potential. And this is another question we've been getting about tax implications. And, you know, this is also something we're going to make sure we're going to engage with the community and making sure that whatever designations are happening, it's happening for folks where it makes sense. And this is also something that's going to be continuously analyzed and studied. So I wanted to make it clear that this is just the beginning of the process. By selecting option D, we're giving the planning department the tools to study this further and provide a report that we will be presenting to the community as we go forward. So here are some other resources that you can follow. Links. So I think we're going to probably have this in some kind of format. I'll leave it up to Zoe to figure that one out. And that is the end of my presentation. Sorry it was so technical and a little bit arduous in nature, but I wanted to get everything out there.
Thank you, Partap, for that very detailed presentation. We are now going to pivot into a general Q&A with all 3 panelists. Go ahead and submit your questions in the Q&A chat. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to call on whichever panelist seems to have the most specifics, so like their presentation that's most clearly aligned with the question, and then anybody else will be able to chime in. So we're going to start with this question is for Jane. In the Bethesda area around Whitman, you can't get anywhere without a car. So is the plan, Thrive 2050, going to benefit all communities? And if Bethesda area gets even better infrastructure-wise, how is it not just going to become more expensive?
All right, and yes, I can hear you now, Zoe, which is very exciting. Thank you for the question. So yes, the idea is that the Thrive 2050 plan is going to benefit and look at all communities in Montgomery County, although I'll caveat this by saying that the implementation of the plan is supposed to take place over the next 30 years. That's why Thrive 2050, and the chairman of the board has often said that he doesn't just see this as a 30-year plan, but wants this to be able to stretch even longer into into the next 50 years or so. So nothing's going to happen overnight, including our mode of choice in different regions of the county, whether it's easier to drive or to take other modes of transportation. And I'll say that yes, better infrastructure definitely does increase land values most of the time. And so that's why it's really important. I think I saw a question about the purple line as well before, that as we're adding this new infrastructure, such as the purple line into communities, that we're also adopting really strong affordable housing policies. I'm on the Purple Line Corridor Coalition Housing Action Team, which is a mouthful. And we're a group of different nonprofits and government offices and outside stakeholders who are really interested in how to ensure that the Purple Line stays affordable and that the people who live along the Purple Line can continue to live there and to benefit from that new infrastructure. So that's one example, but that's going to be true for everywhere that sees infrastructure improvements in the county. And one last point is that one of the things that they've been talking about in very recently in Thrive 2050 is a recommended action about studying land value capture. And land value capture is a very technical thing, but basically it's a way that it's basically a tax that the public sector can use to then regain some of the value. I'm really bad at explaining it. When the prices rise, they can regain some of that value because the prices rose from the public infrastructure investment. I'm really bad at explaining land value taxes, and maybe somebody else can explain them better, but things like that where you can capture the public investment and then reinvest it in things like affordable housing. That's some of the ideas that are being talked about. There are a ton of different ideas and strategies for affordable housing, but it is, I totally agree, really important to implement those policies as communities change.
Does anyone else want to chime in?
Maybe Dan can explain land value taxes better, but I don't know if we want to get too into that right now.
No, yes, no.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. Maybe we'll come back to that. And if nobody else wants to chime in, let's move on to this question is for Dan. How do the housing moratoriums in some regions impact de facto segregation in Montgomery County Public Schools?
That's a great question. There are so many awesome questions this evening. I'm really grateful for having the chance to have this conversation. But to explain what the moratorium is, basically, Montgomery County is the only place in the DC area where if the schools get over a certain percentage of their capacity, or if the roads, if traffic on the roads gets above a certain threshold, the county can basically stop approving new homes in that area. And this is the only place in the region where it happens, and has often been used. It has two purposes. One is the idea is this is like the last ditch effort, and if you go into moratorium, you won't be able to build anything, so we're going to figure out how to get funding for some new school construction or for whatever road or transportation improvement that's needed. It sometimes is also used to deny growth in places. Right now, there's a large portion of Silver Spring, Wheaton, and Bethesda that are currently in housing moratorium because of this. For 2 years, you have not been allowed to submit a permit to build a new home in any of these communities because the schools are overcrowded. The intention is that the county and the school system are supposed to figure out how to create more capacity in the schools. That's part of why the school boundary study is so important, because we have 10,000 empty seats and 10,000 students in portables. And in the areas where schools are overcrowded, we're not allowing people to build new homes there. And it doesn't stop people from moving to those places. It either puts people somewhere else, either outside of the county, or it basically drives up home prices in a community and displaces people and further entrenches the segregation that we already see. So as Jane has been working on, the moratorium is going to go away for the most part in the county's new growth policy, and it should, because it doesn't actually solve the problem of we need more classroom space or we need more transportation. It really just allows us to pretend like we can just stop people from coming to live here, which is not true.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I went to, just graduated from a school that proportionally is the most overcrowded in the county. Clarksburg High School has 13 portables, and next year we'll have 15, despite the recent boundary change to send us to Seneca Valley. And not only did So it really goes to show how ineffective the moratoria are, because no moratoria got set in place. And Clarksburg is actually the fastest growing region of the county, yet we're the most overcrowded. And meanwhile, other schools are growing not because of more housing being built, but because most of the school population growth actually comes from neighborhood turnover, where old people age out of certain housing, they move, and young families with all their kids come, and now there's more kids, the population is multiplied, even though no new housing is being built. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay, cool. This next question is a little spicy, and I kind of want to call on Partap for this, but I hope he doesn't get in trouble for this. So Mike English asks, it's no secret that County Executive Elrich is not a fan of many of the things we'd like to achieve here, as I think was outlined in the sector staging policy discussion yesterday. How far are these actually being realized, and what are the chances of these needed changes going forward in light of likely opposition from the executive?
Well, I can answer that. So the county executive doesn't decide land use decisions. So that's one thing that we should be aware of the process. So after it goes through our planning department, who's going to be very thorough in giving their analysis and providing feedback, engaging with the community, the planning board ultimately will vote on this. And then once again, it will go through additional processes at the county council level. So the county executive does opine and provide their opinions and feedback on what we do, but largely speaking, unless it is in terms of some cases where there's implementation of county-owned parcels, the county executive has jurisdiction over that. But in terms of the county executive, we're hoping that the Elrich administration will also evolve. Tacoma Park, where Mark Elrich lived for many years, and I think still does live, has a diverse housing supply. There are some missing middle, there's bungalows, there's mid-rises, all in the neighborhood. And so, I'm hoping that he will see that there's a benefit to this, and this is the future of our county, and will support, especially if we decide as the planning board to go in that direction.
Anybody else want to chime in? Yes,
I'll chime in. Yeah, I echo everything that Partap said. I think that a really good litmus test for the county executive's sort of political sway on these issues was with the accessory dwelling unit battle that happened, I guess that was last summer now. And an accessory dwelling unit is basically a type of missing middle housing where you're allowed to build like a cottage in your backyard that somebody can live in, or like an attachment to your house, or like a separate apartment in your basement. That's what's known as an ADU. And the county council was considering a zoning amendment that would make it easier to build that type of housing. And Elrich, the county executive, was very opposed to that. And the county council still ended up voting unanimously to support that expansion of accessory dwelling units. That's not to say that it'll definitely go that way with legalizing other types of legalizing other types of missing middle housing. But I think it shows that it just reinforces that the county executive is not who makes these land use decisions. And even though the planning board is very important, and I'm very glad that Partap is there, so many things about land use in this county come down to the county council, because they're who decide whether the zoning code can be amended, can be changed.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jane, because you brought up ADUs, I'm going to pivot to another question asked, and I'm going to hop to Dan for this one because Jane kind of started it off and had the ball rolling. The question is, talk about ADUs. The new regulation was very tough to pass. Has it resulted in more applications or units actually coming online? This should be the easiest missing middle piece to add. No government money, and no one is forced to do anything they don't want.
That's a good question. To be honest, I don't know the answer to it. I don't know how many the county has approved, but I think it's a flavor of question we get a lot, because the two the two flavors of homes that are the easiest to like build and get approved in Montgomery County are like big high-rise apartment buildings in a handful of very small areas and like detached single-family houses everywhere else. And like everything else exists, and we can find examples of them in our communities, but because we don't see them being built in our everyday life, or we may not know people who live in those kinds of homes, we just assume that nobody wants them. And so a lot of the questions we had about accessory apartments last year, or that people are saying about missing middle housing this year, is that like, well, who wants to live in a townhome, or who wants to live in an accessory apartment, or wouldn't that be really difficult or expensive to build? And the answer is to all of these things is, you know, things are going to be as easy or as difficult as we want them to be. If we create a regulatory climate that privileges people who want to live in $1 million detached houses, then that's what we're going to get. And everything else will distort around that policy. So if we make it easier for people to build accessory apartments, I'm sure we'll see some. If we make it easier to build different types of homes, we'll see some. But if we choose to make it difficult, then we're not going to do it. And we're going to wonder why.
Zoe, can I say something?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, like, Partap, do you want to say something?
No, I totally agree with what Dan is saying. And, you know, I'm hopeful, you know, so I'm building a house 1 block from the Forest Glen Metro. And I was excited when I found out that I was the first new construction home to have an ADU, because the previous regulation didn't allow you to do that. You would have to, I think the house had to be at least 4 years old, which made no sense because new housing usually has, you know, good bones and the latest technology, insulation. In some cases, you know, you have to have the water sprinkler system. So there's all these things. And so the idea now of, you know, can people be, there's so many teardowns happening, can you create homes? In my case, I'm doing an intergenerational suite for my parents, an ADU for up to 2 people can live there. It's going to be a great little unit. That's a 2-minute walk to the metro. My 3 kids, and then I also have a little area for my nanny. So up to 10 people can live in this house. Whereas you see in many cases, people are building houses and it's like 3 people. And that's fine. This is America. We're a free country. It's a free market. But if we don't think about how we can change our policies, our regs, our laws to promote a diverse group of housing, then we shouldn't be surprised when it doesn't happen. And so that was a huge reason why I wanted to share my space with another total stranger, is because I want people to have access to the metro. And I'm so excited that we got a tremendous amount of density at Forest Glen Metro, and knock on wood, I'm hoping that it actually gets developed. But I do think, you know, as we were saying, you if you plan it, they shall come, and and I'm hoping the same will happen with Silver Spring.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's what it's about, right? Like, as I think both Dan and Jane kind of highlighted this, we want more density near transit. We want a lot of people to live near transit so they can get to work more easily. So what you're doing is truly fantastic, and we need people not occupying up huge acres for 2 people. Anyway, our next question, I kind of want to pivot to Jane for this one because it's about Thrive 2050. Some people are saying that the pandemic changed how people feel about density and public transportation. Do you see this as having an influence on the county master plan in the time frame you described? And I imagine that Partap will also want to chime in.
Yeah, I think Partap will definitely have a great answer to this as well. I think it's something, I mean, that's obviously happened very recently, and the development of Thrive 2050 has been happening for a lot longer amount of time than coronavirus has been a thing. So I think that they are taking it into consideration in the latest policies and actions update to the working draft. They included a section about coronavirus and how we don't know how it's going to play out. And I think that anybody who's saying that they know how this is going to affect any facet of life is completely talking out of their behind, because nobody knows how this is going to go. And but I think that there's a lot that we can point to show that that housing markets are still strong in the DC region. People are still leasing up buildings very quickly. In a lot of the other countries where people have started to be able to return to work, wearing face masks on transit has proved to be very effective. And the transmission rate of COVID has been very low on transit, and it's a lot safer than previously thought, which has made me feel better, because for one, I honestly felt a little bit nervous. I don't have a car, and so I don't know what I would do if I wasn't able to ever take transit again. But I think seeing those studies and really understanding it better has made me feel personally better about continuing to live a car-free lifestyle. And I think will help others to feel the same way. So I'm optimistic, but I won't pretend like I know for sure how it's going to affect cities and development in the future. I think it has shown the importance of neighbors, though, and that it is really, really necessary in a time of crisis to have people in your community who you can rely on, and to build communities where there's a lot of trust and mutual aid networks and all of those things that aren't possible without having a really strong built environment that encourages people to get to know each other.
Zoe, do you want me to opine a little bit on that as well? Yeah, no, I generally agree with Jane said. And I think one thing we know for sure is how fragile our economies are. I mean, with COVID-19 happening, there's a recognition that, we're going to have this significant shortfall. How are we going to deal with that? Do we need to have a larger tax base? Do we need to have a more dynamic economy? How do we deal with housing shortages? These are all things that I think we realize how vulnerable we are. The DC area has always been this kind of bubble of, oh, the recession will happen, we won't really get affected. Well, we do get affected. And certain neighborhoods, as Dan have mentioned, get disproportionately more affected. And so I think, when the next pandemic happens, and it sounds like it can happen again, we're going to be more prepared. There's going to be more understanding about social distancing. Hopefully we'll have a better understanding of the do's and the do nots. But I see a place where potentially planning can change a little bit. I imagine maybe more smaller healthcare centers that could be integrated into communities where services can be provided. If people are quarantining together, I know some people have talked about like a kind of a trust where like an entire neighborhood kind of quarantines together. And so it's like a kind of isolated area, and people can continue to somewhat work and play and have some sort of social interaction within that trust space. So these are all ideas that I think are going to probably come out once we have a better understanding of what just happened. Because I think we've had so much conflicting information. There's so much we don't know. And hopefully once we get a better picture, we'll be able to plan accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds great. Like the little communities that you just mentioned. It's not really a quarantine. It's more like a quarantown. Am I right? Okay. I feel like I'm not really sure who the best person to answer this question is, so I'm just going to pick on Dan because he hasn't spoken in a while. What tools are there for getting high-density developments to develop more 3 to 4 bedroom units, or for encouraging greater use of group lodging, private rooms, but shared facilities?
That's something that I think a lot of people talk about. It's, big apartments aren't super common, but they are really valuable. My partner and I lived in an apartment complex in North Bethesda that was almost entirely 2 and 3 bedroom units. And it was filled with families because it was the one place that you could live in that community where you could pay a reasonable rent. And I'm talking like $1,800 or $2,000 a month. You could walk to the metro, you could walk to tons of shopping. You were in a very high ranked school catchment. Those apartments were super valuable. At the same time, it can be financially difficult for developers to build larger apartments, because if you think about it, like, apartments require plumbing and kitchen and bathroom and electrical stuff. And, you can put, you can make lots of little 1-bedrooms and rent them for a lot more than if that same space was 1 3-bedroom apartment. So there's a disincentive to do that, which raises the question, like, can we create policies that encourage bigger apartments? Maybe. I'm not totally sure what they are. I do think part of the answer is just simply providing more housing choices, full stop, simply because, sort of as the question like implies, some people who are living in 3 and 4-bedroom apartments are also roommate situations. A lot of my friends live in an apartment complex in Silver Spring called Summit Hills, which was built in the 50s and has gigantic 3 and 4-bedroom apartments. But if those people had access to more affordable studios and 1-bedrooms, would they still be as much need for the big 3 and 4-bedroom apartments for roommates? And would those then be available for families? So, I mean, I don't think every answer to every question is we need more supply, but I do think this is one of those, like, if we just had more supply, then people could find the home that is actually right for them and not trying to jerry-rig another option.
One thing I thought was really interesting was talking to some people who work for Montgomery Housing Partnership, which provides affordable housing to low-income households and families, was that their sort of wait list is much more for 1 and 2-bedroom apartments than it is for 3 and 4-bedroom apartments, which sort of turns on the head what I had previously thought about what people want. And I don't know what people want. And that is just one example of how that perception isn't always true. A lot of families are looking for 2-bedroom units and not necessarily 3-bedroom units. And so, yeah, I thought that was very interesting to learn.
Great. I'm going to pitch this question over to Jane. Jane, can you provide examples of communities that are getting it right, able to keep up with housing demand, diverse housing, affordable/attainable? Who can we look for to guidance?
Yeah, and I'll call on both Dan and Partap as well. I think that it's hard to find examples within the United States because most places in the United States have a similar story of the automobile expanding sprawl and the same GI Bill and the same Federal Housing Administration redlining policies. So Montgomery County in that way is not unique. And so it's hard to find places that somehow got around that. I think that we are starting to see in other states in the US changes to and reexaminations of single family zoning. So Minneapolis recently passed legislation that legalized duplexes and triplexes across the entire city. And so I think that was one of the first major steps in the right direction. California, for a few years now, has been considering statewide legislation to increase density around transit stations. Nebraska got rid of single-family zoning with a duplex bill. So did Oregon. So it's starting to be a movement nationwide in the United States, and then I think there are a lot of great options when we look at other countries across the entire world for how they do land use regulations and build their communities. So I think of the places that you enjoy to go on vacation and walk around, and why do you enjoy walking around those places and just looking at the built environment? It's because they have like 0 setbacks, for example, and we have pretty significant setbacks. And all these like design regulations that change our built environments and change how they feel. And I think another great example is just to look back at the United States before the 1950s. And to look at some of these older neighborhoods. Like, for example, I used to live in College Park when I was in university, and Old Town College Park is a great example of beautiful pre-World War II single-family homes, a lot of them that are now group homes for college students. I lived in a triplex. There are a bunch of small apartment buildings, and the whole neighborhood is like a 10-minute walk from the metro station. So there are a lot of great examples, a lot of places that we already love.
Anyone else want to pitch in? Okay.
I want to echo what Jane said. I mean, the places in the U.S. that are affordable tend to be really sprawly because we've allowed those places to grow, and that's the one direction they grow in. You know, there are cities like Chicago that still manage to build lots of housing and can keep prices down, but that hasn't solved other problems in that city. And I mean, I it's challenging because like Jane said, like in the US, like we have this like whole like legacy and weight of planning and housing policy that was designed to make things expensive and exclusive. Um, and it's a lot of unlearning that we have to do if we really want to make our communities more equitable and inclusive.
Yeah, so we're about 20 minutes before the end, and I'm loving these super duper detailed answers to the questions. This is exactly what I was envisioning in my dreams. So I think we have time for 2, 3, maybe more questions. Let's see. I think this is a good question for either Dan or Partap. I guess I'll pitch it to Partap because he hasn't spoken in a while. As the Purple Line and expanded zoning flexibility presumably drive up land values in downtown Silver Spring, what efforts will there be to protect existing tenants and property owners from impacts of increasing values, taxes, and costs?
That's a good question. I think that's always a fear, is that as you bring in a transit line that's going to be very desirable, and that's a question I think that's happening particularly in areas in Prince George's County near Langley Park, and there are groups that are focusing on how do we make sure that there are affordable options. And I think, you know, that's a challenge you have in a free market where you can have people, developers coming in, and you can have kind of a scenario where people who once upon a time were living in what may be known as naturally occurring affordable housing are now being displaced. And I think the important thing that's why these community conversations are so important. And that's why it's so important to make sure that we're planning in a way where we're allowing all types of housing. And one of the things that I think is not often discussed, and we can expand on it, I'm sure Dan and Jane also have opinions on this, is that, you know, when we're talking about affordable housing, that is so important because we know that not only have housing costs gone out of control, but there are entire generations, an entire generation of people now that may never be able to actually afford to purchase a home. And namely Generation Z and millennials. So this is becoming a problem to the extent that we see housing as being kind of like this equalizing factor of people who are able to retain a certain net worth and be able to do things like, you know, go to grad school or have another option of moving in a certain part of the county. And so I think a planning process that ensures that there's all types of housing, a healthy tax base, and also focusing on things that we value as a society is really what allows us to have those special projects. And we're seeing that happen in Silver Spring with the art space. There's a recent affordable housing project on Fenton Street. These are all these things that I think are possible, but we as a community need to support these projects and allow for the zoning that allows it to come forward. You know, recently Montgomery Housing Partnership was able to put a significant building that they development on a site that they previously had about 80 units, and I believe now they're going to have 200 plus units. And so that's a good option. That's a good example of a project where now you're having families, and in some cases 2-3 bedroom scenarios that of kind of apartment structures which are about a 5 or 6 minute walk to the metro. So it can happen. Where there's a will, there's a way. And I think the important thing is we need to continue to have these conversations and make sure that our planning process and how things go forward from that represent everyone.
Does anyone else want to comment on that? That was about Purple Line and gentrification.
I mean, I want to echo what's been said. I mean, one of the best things that we can do to make sure that people, there's a short-term solution, which is, ensuring better tenant protections and rent stabilization where necessary to make sure people can stay in their homes after the Purple Line is built and receive all the benefits from it. And the other is to, create more opportunities for housing along the Purple Line so that people can actually find homes there and not, fight each other and bid prices up for the few homes that do exist. I mean, the only people who benefit from bidding wars and rent hikes are incumbent homeowners. And it's not in my interest as somebody who, busted their butt to try and find a home they could afford near transit to prevent other people from doing the same.
Yeah, let's go with 2 more questions. Let's see. I don't want to single out anyone here. Well, this is a good one. So, do we know? I'll send this to Jane. Do we know theoretically how many residents the county's current zoning supports? And will the new plan be based on assumed future populations? How much more housing needs to be built to accommodate that projected population?
I don't know the answer to the first question about how many residents the current zoning supports. This would be a great question for Lisa Gavoni, the housing planner in the planning department, who always knows these numbers off the top of her head. But yes, they have recently done a housing needs assessment of Montgomery County, as well as there have been a lot of other assessments done of the entire region about our regional housing needs. So they are definitely, in all of these future plans, taking into consideration the people who are projected to move into Montgomery County. And let's see, I think I lost where the question was for the third part. What was the third question there?
Said, what tools are there for getting development? Oh, sorry, no, well, I don't know where it went.
Oh, how much more housing needs to be built to accommodate that population? So that specific answer that I do not have on the top of my head can be found in the housing needs report, which I'll link to in the chat right after this. But I believe that we have an additional, what was in your presentation, Dan? 20,000 people?
200,000 people.
200, yeah, sorry, 200,000 people who are coming. And so slightly less than that in housing is my answer. And I will link to the housing needs report. And if one of you guys knows the answer to that.
So I've been texting Lisa Gavoni.
Perfect.
So she says the planning department has a residential capacity analysis coming very soon, where the planning department will be taking a detailed look into our zoning capacity and how many units we can actually support. So coming soon to a planning board session near you.
How exciting.
Very exciting. Thank you for that. Okay, so the last question I'm going to ask is kind of a selfish one. We know that a lot of these kind of community hearings often leave out Up County. So my question is specifically about Up County, where I live. I live in Germantown, which is very sprawly and bad. I love it, but I don't have a car, and I walk and I take transit, and it's not a walkable community at all. What can be done for places like Germantown and places around the county, kind of going back to the Bethesda question too, that are already developed, that are already single-family zoned, and aren't walkable and don't fit into this vision of Thrive 2050? And it's kind of a general question, so anybody can answer that.
I mean, I can relate to that experience a lot. I mean, my family, we lived in downtown Silver Spring and moved out to East County, like White Oak and Burtonsville, and those communities, I think, share a lot of the same challenges and origins as Germantown and the Up County, and are often in very much the same place now, where it's like you have a lot of people who either want alternatives to driving or need alternatives to driving and are just not being provided for. One of the good examples, I think, a vision of where Germantown and places like it in the county could go is Germantown Town Center. Like it is 20 years old, but it was, a county plan that envisioned creating a walkable downtown there that has slowly been executed over the past 20 years. It's a place where you can walk to a little transit hub with buses that take you to other parts of the county, and hopefully one day fixed guideway like light rail or BRT or something. It has a range of stuff that you can do, daily needs like groceries, restaurants, a library, a performing arts center, a movie theater. It doesn't have a lot of office jobs, so there's some jobs on a huge range of jobs, and there's housing there close enough that you can walk to all of those things and avail yourself of those things. And for people who want to live in a walkable community in Montgomery County and have access to stuff without getting in a car, Germantown Town Center is one of the few fairly affordable places you can do that. Of course, it comes at a cost, which is that like you have to have a car to leave it. I think we can make more places like that. I think Montgomery County is ahead of a lot of places in making places like that. I want to see more things like that. I want to let 1,000 Germantown Town Centers bloom.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Guys neglecting Up County. That went a lot quicker than I expected, so we still have 10 minutes, so I'm going to keep asking questions, and if you disagree, you can leave. Bossy's been asking some really hard questions, and I don't really understand them, so I'm going to ask them to you guys. Hopefully you understand them. He asks, I understand some areas are not developing because property owners are waiting until they can command Bethesda-level rents, but the public interest needs them to develop at lower rents. What tools are there for getting development to proceed sooner at lower values? And this sounds like a question that would be good for Partap.
Well, that's a difficult question. So that is true. I mean, we see that happen in Wheaton. We see that in Glenmont, where you have kind of either it's many different owners or one big owner that's holding out to say, okay, I want to wait till this property goes higher in value. And there's different ways of tackling this. In some cases, it may make sense for the county to buy them out. And I say that in the place of, we're looking at our own parcels that we own that are currently underutilized, where we could actually, if the planning department will recommend a certain kind of zoning for an area, county council approves it, then we can control the process. The county executive can control the process for putting affordable housing in an area that may not otherwise have it. So that has happened in the past. This is one of the questions that we get, and it's difficult because we do live in a free market. And there are a few instances where we take property away, and it's usually in rare instances of, a good example is eminent domain, where you're taking it for a larger public purpose. But we can encourage it through proper planning and really setting a vision for a community that works for everyone. And hopefully we can help guide people into a direction that facilitates that kind of vision. So it is a very challenging scenario, and we do see it in the county quite a bit. And I'm hopeful that as we move forward, we'll be able to at least help solve that problem as much as we can.
Do you mind if I chime in, Zoe? Yeah, I think that's a really good question and a really hard question, because it does get down to everything that Partap was saying is this is a free market, and sometimes that results in outcomes that aren't in the public interest. But I think we have to look at why do developers need rents to be so high to pay for the things that they're building? And I think it comes down to two main reasons. One is because construction costs are really high right now, higher than they have been in past decades. Part of that is because of labor. Labor has become really, really expensive for construction. And then that goes even back to like immigration law about like who is doing this work? How much are we paying people for that work? So it opens up then a lot of even bigger questions, but construction costs are really high. And then land prices are also very high. And that gets at what some of Partap was saying about looking at county-owned land or buying out land, so that we can take that part of the cost out of the equation. So that way it's not as expensive to build, and when it's not as expensive to build, then rents don't have to be as high. So it's a really hard question to tackle, and there are a few ways to do it, but it's definitely not easy, and none of us have all the answers.
Yeah. Okay, so we have 5 minutes, so let's do one more question. Let's do this is a quick one. So any update on the future of the Lake Forest Mall site or the White Flint Mall site, and what can we do with it? And Dan had some facial expressions, so I'll pitch it to him.
I don't know. Lake Forest gets to reopen soon because the governor's going to open malls. But
No.
it's a big question. I mean, what do we do with these large shopping malls that are no longer viable? As fewer brick and mortar retail, people are doing more shopping online. Like, I don't know of any firm plans for either of those places. White Flint Mall's plans fell apart because Lord & Taylor sued the owner of the rest of the mall to keep them from doing anything, and now they're not. And Lake Forest, the new mall owner appears to want to continue operating it as a traditional enclosed mall, despite the possibility that there may not be as much demand for it. So I second Amy. It would be cool to see some development where people can walk to transit and possibly some much needed housing there. And there's potential to do something cool there, but we just have to bide our time.
And I think I saw somewhere where Lord & Taylor was going bankrupt, right?
Yes.
Oh, finally.
So even though we had all those problems there, it's possible that could be in play. We did the White Flint master plan, and there's a proposal for a street grid there, and there's a lot of potential there. So I'm hopeful that maybe something can happen.
Before you close us out, Zoe, can I make one last push for continuing this conversation with the events we have in August? Sweet. All right.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much to everybody for coming tonight, and thank you so much to Zoe for organizing this. This has been awesome. So I just put in the chat that we should not let the conversation end here. This should not be the first and the last time that we talk about how zoning makes our communities less sustainable and less inclusive. So register at the link that I put in the chat, which has 3 events about courageous conversations on housing, land use, and racism. Register for the event that most closely matches where you live in Montgomery County. And those facilitated workshops will happen in August, also on Zoom. So I look forward to seeing you all there again.
I'm also going to do some closing remarks, but does anyone else want to say anything before I do?
I think we should thank Zoe for putting together this amazing event and for creating this space. You did an awesome job.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Jane. You guys are the future of voices in Montgomery County, and it's so wonderful to be a part of this. Even though I'm substantially older than all of you, you make me feel young. But special thanks to the planning department and Lisa Gavoni for helping me with my presentation, and also thank you for inviting me.
Okay, great. So thank you all for tuning in tonight. As Jane mentioned in her portion, this is not the end. This is just the beginning. When you all submitted your Google Forms, one of the questions was, are you interested in getting further involved? Everyone who answered yes to that question will be receiving a Slack link in a follow-up email to join this fight and join Thrive 2050 and continue the advocacy, not just for Thrive 2050, but for the Silver Spring Plan that Partap mentioned in his portion. And if you don't remember what you put, you can still head on over to that link at tinyurl.com/MoCo zoning. You can submit as many responses as you want and just clarify your response to that yes, you want to continue to get involved. this is my first time ever hosting anything like this, so I tried to set up like a post Zoom survey. I don't know if it'll work. I think it's supposed to come up when the end call ends. I don't know if it'll work, but if you want to provide any feedback, positive feedback only, you can email me at zoe20@gmail.com. I should have been the one who emailed you all RSVP links. And Trudy of Sierra Club asked me to shout out one of her events coming up. Sierra Club Montgomery County bi-monthly virtual meeting on July 20th. We'll have a panel discussion on missing middle. For anyone who wants to join, email Trudy. I just put her email in the chat. And again, Jane also threw a link in the chat for Courageous Conversation, so definitely tune into that. We have a lot of work ahead of us. These plans are multi-year, so we need people to get involved now so that we can keep up the fight in 2 years. And with that, I think we're going to close out. Thank you, Dan, Jane, and Partap for your amazing presentations, for taking 2 hours out of your incredibly busy days to sit down with the community and have this conversation. And I look forward to more of these because I think it went very successfully.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Zoe.
Oh, and last thing, yes, this meeting was recorded, so I will send out a link to the slideshows that everybody had, as well as some of the events that we mentioned today, and the recording to all the people who registered, for the people who couldn't make it. Right? That's all. Thank you guys so much, and you have a fantastic weekend. Go out and enjoy the open streets. Georgia Avenue is open, Bethesda Urban Partnerships open, Rockville is open. Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Hi,
Good
everyone.
night.